Most of us know by now that lead exposure is, scientifically speaking, not great. But it turns out we may be better at handling it than archaic humans were, and that may even have influenced our very brain development itself. There's no question our lead exposure peaked with industrialization. We can track that because when we take in lead, it can be taken up by multiple organs and even stored in our skeletal compartments. It includes teeth, which can have detectable lead bands, particularly when the exposure includes early childhood. Lead was incredibly useful in industrial applications, and there were thousands of cases of lead poisoning every year, especially among lead miners, smelters, and scrappers in the late 19th and early 20th century. We are past the peak of it, but despite all our unleaded gasoline and our lead-free paint chips, lead is still part of the modern environmental exposure landscape. But it's not like we never encountered lead until the 18th century. There are records of lead-based face powder in the ancient world, for instance. Yeah, it was, probably not worth it. And in this new study from Scientific Advances, our history of lead exposure is actually millions of years old. These researchers discovered that ancient history of lead exposure by examining fossil teeth, finding lead bands in them like we found, to an even greater extent, in tooth samples from the Industrial Age. And it wasn't just anatomically modern humans. Teeth from Neanderthals and Denisovans, even in samples from as late as 1.8 million years ago. Right there, that's already pretty remarkable. There's no reason to think that all of these archaic humans a million years ago were putting on lead-based makeup or anything. So these data suggest that environmental lead exposure has been a part of being a human on this earth for a long, long time. And not just when we actively went mining the stuff. Now, if lead exposure only affected our teeth, that wouldn't be great or anything, but personally, I really don't care for the way that it affects the brain. Lead is neurotoxic and can cause neurocognitive and behavioral impairments, and even though we're past the 20th century peak of lead exposure, we are still exposed enough that there's a robust body of research about exactly what lead does to the brain. One way scientists study the effects of lead is to set themselves up with little brain organoids. We've talked about these before. These are the few millimeters of neural tissue that we set up in a 3D tissue culture so we can study human brain cells without actually experimenting on, living human brains. In a previous study in 2017, researchers sprinkled lead on the brain organoid, then measured how its gene expression changed compared to organoids that weren't exposed to lead. Of course, biology is complex, and a whole host of genes changed in response to the lead exposure. But one of the genes that was disrupted by that exposure is a brain-specific factor called NOVA1, which in turn regulates a whole host of other genes. So, NOVA1 regulates a bunch of genes, and that regulation changes in response to lead exposure. Okay. There's one other kind of funky thing about NOVA1 in this context. Archaic humans, like Neanderthals and Denisovans, had a different variant of the gene than we do. Remember, we share the overwhelming majority of our genetic code with those archaic humans, but obviously not everything. Some Neanderthal alleles, for instance, are present in the genomes of some, though not all modern-day humans. But in the case of NOVA1, modern humans pretty much have one version and archaic humans have another. That suggests, but does not confirm, that there was selective pressure on modern humans toward the version of NOVA1 that we have, rather than the one present in archaic humans. But what's the difference? To answer that, our researchers put the archaic version of NOVA1 into brain organoids, then compared their response to lead exposure to brain organoids with the modern version of the gene. The organoids with the archaic version of NOVA1 were more vulnerable to the lead exposure, particularly in types of neurons that express genes associated with language and speech. By contrast, the organoids with our version of NOVA1 did not see the same amount of disruption. Does that mean that we have our version of Nova 1 because it protected us from neurotoxicity from lead exposure? Did it shape the evolution of our cognition and communication? Possibly, but not necessarily. We know that we have a different version of Nova 1 than archaic humans. It's even quite likely that there was positive selective pressure on us to have the version of the gene we have, rather than it just being random genetic drift that ended up getting fixed in our population's genetics. After all, our differences in cognition very likely shaped our evolutionary history in competition with Neanderthals. But the resilience to lead exposure may or may not be related to why we ended up with the version of Nova 1 that we did. Maybe it also protects us from other environmental contaminants. Heck, maybe its effects on gene regulation are totally different in an actual human brain versus a little bit of neural tissue in a petri dish. Of course, we have no way of knowing that. We can't exactly test the effects of lead exposure on living human brains with the Neanderthal version of Nova 1. For one, we don't actually have archaic humans available. Two, if we did, the last thing we would do is expose them to a ton of lead for science. But the study's authors make strong claims nonetheless. One author, Manish Arora, said, quote, "This study shows how our environmental exposures shaped our evolution." We may be looking at a more circumstantial case than that. We know that archaic and early modern humans were meaningfully exposed to lead, and we know that modern humans have genetic changes that seem to make us more resilient to that lead exposure. That resilience may protect specific cognitive functions of our brain in particular. But that doesn't mean we have this variant because it protects us from lead exposure, which is what the study's author is saying. Maybe we have the version of Nova 1 we have for a completely different reason, especially since it's this regulator of neural gene expression. Those reasons could have nothing to do with lead, and the resilience is a nice to have, not a need to have. And if you're hearing me say a whole lot of maybe, well, that's because it is the peril of paleogenetics and evolutionary biology like this. We can observe that we have a different version of this gene than Neanderthals. That's provable. We can see they're different. We can't observe why we ended up being different. There will always be the possibility that we evolved the way we did for reasons we don't yet understand. It's the mystery of history. So these authors have given us some observations, and those we know for sure. There definitely was lead exposure, even 1.8 million years ago, in all these ancient hominids. And from those observations spring the speculation that lead exposure drove genetic change in modern humans in ways that could impact our cognitive ability as we have it today. Science is never about knowing everything. It's about knowing more things than we did yesterday and pitching ideas to try to make sense of it all. And here's an idea I'll pitch. Take it easy on the lead exposure. It's bad for your brain,